The broadcast will start in a few minutes. We're just waiting for a few folks to join.
Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar about the San Francisco Foundation's second open cycle under our Equity Grants Program. I'm Kay Fernandez-Smith, Assistant Vice President of Programs, and on today's call, we'll provide up-to-date information on the guidelines and funding priorities for the People, Place, and Power pathways, and introduce you to Flux, our new online grants management system. Then we'll save time at the end of the call to answer your questions, so please submit in the chat window of the webinar or send questions to programs@sff.org. That's programs@sff.org, which will be answered afterwards and then posted online in an FAQ. I'm joined today by Jidan Terry-Kuhn, Demetrius Bonet, Tessa Callejo, and Jessica Minnick, they'll go over some of the details of our strategies within our pathways. Let me provide you a little bit of context and an overview of our Equity Grants Program and this particular open cycle. In 2016, we launched our equity agenda and deepened our commitment to building greater racial and economic inclusion in the 5 Bay Area counties we serve. Across the region, we want to ensure that everyone has a chance to get a good job, live in a safe and affordable home, has a strong political voice, and can live in a community that provides real access to opportunities. This vision of our equity agenda is realized in 3 interrelated pathways: the People pathway, or expanding access to opportunity, the Place pathway, or anchoring communities, and the Power pathway, nurturing equity movements. To support our program strategies and to make deeper investments in partnership with organizations doing the critical work in the Bay Area, we made our first round of open cycle or competitive grants in 2017 under the Equity Grants Program. And given your feedback, the initial open cycle included more core operating support grants, grants for longer duration, and grants that were larger in size. That being said, it was an extremely competitive open cycle. Out of the 964 applications, we approved 144 grants, which represented 15% of the approved grants. The median grant size was about $80,000, and we were able to make many grants that were multi-year. So for 2018, the Equity Grants Open Cycle is a key opportunity for us to learn from organizations and community leaders across the Bay Area who are closely aligned with our vision and who may or may not have received funding from us in the past. Given the Foundation's commitment to ensure that everyone can thrive and meet their full potential, we're especially committed through the funding priorities of this open cycle to foster the full inclusion and success of people of color and low-income people from across the region. With that, here's a snapshot of this year's guidelines and funding priorities, full details of which will be posted on our website, www.sff.org. We'll also send a follow-up email outlining links and resources as well as FAQs following this call. Given the competitive nature of this process, we tried to be more transparent about the guidelines and decision-making criteria in this year's Equity Grants Open Cycle so that organizations that are doing good work have a better sense of whether they align with our priorities and should or should not apply. This year, we seek to fund and prioritize nonprofit organizations that are, 1, committed to racial and economic equity internally and externally. Your organization should address racial and economic equity as core to your work, and it's connected to rooted in their communities. Your work should align with the priorities that will be outlined by our People, Place, and Power pathways, which you'll hear about from my colleagues in a few minutes. Third, your work demonstrates potential to achieve systemic change. This means your organization is implementing effective, innovative, and scalable models that can ultimately lead to policy, systems, and institutional change. And finally, your organization aligns with our geographic priorities, which means you are located and or serve residents in Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, San Francisco, or San Mateo counties. We'll be focusing on specific communities that offer the greatest opportunity to advance the Foundation's goals. And Demetrius will speak further on this when he describes the work of the PLACE pathway. We appreciate that your work may fall close to or outside our priority funding areas, and we encourage you to review the full details of the draft guidelines. We've sent the link in the chat box. Unfortunately, we will not be prioritizing organizations doing work outside of our criteria during this particular open cycle. We anticipate awarding approximately $11 million through this 2018 open cycle for both general operating support or project support. Grants will be made for 1 or 2 years with a very limited number of groups receiving 3-year grants, and grants will not exceed $100,000 per year. We'll have 2 stages to the application process. Applications will open on March 26th, and applicants will be notified in late June if they've been moved on to Stage 2. We'll review Stage 2 applications through the summer, and grant decisions will be announced in mid-October. We recognize that this is a lengthy process, and as you'll hear later in the call, we have a brand new grants management system in place and want to make sure we give ourselves and applicants time to orient with our new system. If we receive a similar number of applications from last year, this time frame also allows our staff to review and conduct due diligence. I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to share the specific pathway goals and strategies that are being funded during this open cycle. Jidan?
Thank you, Kay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jidan, and I'm the Acting Director for the People Pathway. Our ultimate goal is to advance the economic security of all low-income people within the context of the changing nature of work. Today, I'm going to focus on our funding priorities that are reflected in the open cycle guidelines. I'm assuming that most of us on the call today live in the Bay Area, and it's no news to us that the cost of living, especially the cost of housing, is skyrocketing. On the other hand, income inequality and economic insecurity along racial lines is also rising. These 2 factors working together cause the massive displacement of low-income people of color in the Bay Area, because despite the enormous wealth that we generate in this region, that wealth is not making it into the pockets of low-income people of color. Their incomes cannot keep pace with the cost of living. Economic security at a very fundamental level requires income to match the costs you have to outlay every month to make ends meet. When this actually happens, families have self-determination and choice to stay in the Bay Area or move out, but on their own terms. The People Pathway advances economic security by supporting the following issue areas: work, education, and criminal justice. Last year, we released guidelines that included broad strategies in each of these areas. Over the past 12 months, we took the learning from the last open cycle and met with dozens and dozens of field leaders and experts to both narrow down our framing of the issues as well as the funding priorities within each of these issue areas. So I'm going to talk through these 3 issue areas as we see it, and then dig in a little bit further in terms of our funding priorities per issue area. So the first issue area is work. This is kind of a no-brainer. When people have good jobs, their income increases, and that contributes to their economic security. Secondly, education. When our young people graduate from high school ready for college and careers, Rather than getting pushed out of school through the school to prison to deportation pipeline, they're far more likely to attain higher income work, which again contributes to economic security. Lastly, criminal justice. The negative effect of criminal justice system to the economic well-being and security of low-income communities of color cannot be overstated. This system has created fear and trauma, removed people from their families, and locked them out of employment just because of their entanglement with that system. Reducing the scope and reach of the criminal justice system contributes to the economic security of low-income people of color. And while we target people of color generally, we prioritize elevating three subpopulations: immigrants, formerly incarcerated people, and youth. So within these issue areas, we have three funding priorities in the 2018 Equity Grants Open Cycle. And I'll go through these three funding priorities with you and welcome your comments and thoughts in the question and answer session. Firstly, our work strategy is at its core about workers' rights. The goal of this strategy is to ensure that people of color and low-income residents have fair access to jobs, healthy working conditions, family-sustaining wages, and benefits. We know that worker organizing and policy advocacy is a powerful engine, both to increase access to jobs for those who have historically and systematically been excluded, but also to make existing jobs even better. For policy advocacy efforts, we're supporting those that involve workers themselves. Secondly, our education strategy is about building positive school climate so that students of color are not pushed out of school and criminalized through the school to prison pipeline. Creating positive school climate is intimately linked to both academic success, which prepares students for the good jobs of our work strategy, but also to preventing involvement in the criminal justice system. Youth who complete high school are 3.5 times less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system as those who don't complete high school. We focus on two aspects of positive school climate. The first aspect is building a sense of belonging and safety for all students, particularly those that have been historically pushed out or marginalized, such as undocumented young people, LGBTQ students, and the list could go on. The second aspect is developing or strengthening alternatives to punitive discipline. As we see a lot of great advocacy wins to decrease usage of punitive discipline, we're also seeing the need to support really thoughtful implementation efforts that builds the toolbox of both adults and students to engage in non-punitive positive discipline. We're going to prioritize strategies that address the root causes of disproportional discipline, and that includes trauma-informed approaches as well as efforts that involve students, parents, or teachers in leadership roles. The positive school climate strategy focuses particularly on Oakland Unified School District, the San Francisco Unified School District, and West Contra Costa County Unified School District. We're going to be focusing primarily in high schools, but we'll also consider high-impact middle school activities. Lastly, our criminal justice strategy is about justice reinvestment, which means decreasing public spending on criminal justice and increasing public spending on critical services relating to jobs, housing, and education. So last year, the San Francisco Foundation increased our presence in criminal justice, but in a pretty broad way. And in the intervening 12 months, as we did our strategy work, justice reinvestment emerged as the most powerful lever to drive change at scale. We looked at data. Cities like Oakland spend over 40% of their general budget on policing. Contra Costa County spends 1/5 of its general fund on the sheriff's office and probation combined. Our cities and counties invest too much in activities that lead to criminalizing of people of color, and that does not leave enough for services that support the success of and the true public safety for our communities. Data proves that services and opportunities are the things that prevent violence and incarceration. In this current climate also that is bringing up a lot of increased immigration enforcement, justice reinvestment also includes, in our view, efforts to disrupt the use of local criminal justice resources towards immigration enforcement. such as the leasing of jail beds for ICE detention, as well as the many other ways that local criminal justice entangles with immigration enforcement efforts. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Demetrius to discuss our second pathway, place.
Thank you, Jadon. Good afternoon. My name is Demetrius Burnett, and I'm the Program Officer of the Anchoring Communities, or PLACE, pathway. Today I'll be sharing the goals and funding priorities of the PLACE pathway for our 2018 Equity Grants Open Cycle. We recognize that the Bay Area's diverse communities anchor the region. They provide families with a home, as well as the social, cultural, spiritual, and economic networks that support and sustain them. However, the region's growing wealth disparity and lack of affordable housing are contributing to gentrification and displacement, threatening to fundamentally alter the cultural, economic, and racial fabric of the Bay Area. The Anchoring Communities, or PLACE, pathway is working to prevent the displacement of low-income people, communities of color, and the local organizations that serve them. Our aim is to ensure that the region's neighborhoods are places where all residents can live, work, thrive, and create. Thus, as a pathway, we focus on three funding priorities. The first is increasing the affordable housing supply, and we do so by supporting organizations that do the work through the industry's 3 Ps: protection, preservation, and production. Protection is in our support of efforts and organizations that seek to protect residents from displacement. The San Francisco Foundation has set high priority on protection-oriented activities and policies, such as rent control. Preservation. Preservation seeks to preserve existing affordable housing opportunities by supporting organizations working to maintain or expand the stock of affordable housing. Then there's production. Production is our effort to support organizations working to increase affordable housing stock through capital financing options such as bond measures and capital funds. Our second funding priority comes in the promotion of multidisciplinary arts and culture, what we simply call arts and culture. Our funding priority on arts and culture seeks to support organizations who promote healing and belonging, promote storytelling, and develop power through narrative. Promote healing and belonging is about using the arts and cultural practices to promote community healing, a sense of belonging and cohesion through cultural activities and art. We're also looking for those working to promote storytelling, whether it's spoken, written, visually represented, musical, theatrical, or more. Storytelling works to preserve the history of local communities. Then there's power through narrative. We look to support organizations that support narratives that build community power, as well as the voice of people of color and low-income residents to meaningfully advocate for their vision and shift mainstream perceptions. Finally, PLACE's third funding priority is to support community anchors. Community anchors are trusted organizations that connect families to resources and opportunity so that they feel rooted in their communities and have a clear path to self-determination. These community anchors also serve as a trusted gathering place or a refuge, providing a safe, respectful space for residents to feel self-determined and supported. The PLACE pathway is also interested in funding organizations that work in what we call priority neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where data reveals high concentrations of people of color and families, limited economic opportunity, which is indicated through education outcomes, poverty level, unemployment rates, and median income, and risk of displacement, identified through housing burden, policy ballot measures, and markers of displacement and gentrification. The foundation is clear that we are not a place-based funder because our funding is not restricted to specific cities. However, the PLACE team will prioritize applications whose work supports priority neighborhoods as they are aligned with the Foundation's racial and economic equity agenda. More information about these neighborhoods can be found in our guidelines, which for your reference also include some names of cities and neighborhoods that are examples of such priority neighborhoods. Now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Tessa, who will provide an overview of the third equity pathway, nurturing equity.
Thank you, Demetrius. Good afternoon. I'm Tessa Callejo, and I'm the Senior Program Officer of the Nurturing Equity Movements, or POWER Pathway. I'm excited to share with you the funding priorities for our POWER Pathway this open cycle. The POWER Pathway aims to ensure that people of color and low-income residents have strong political voice and power and can shape the decisions that affect their lives and their communities. We are living in challenging times where we're engaged in a multitude of fights here in the Bay Area and across the nation, from protecting immigrant families from deportation to the displacement of people of color who have been longtime Bay Area residents, and so much more. Community leaders are organizing their families, their neighbors, from the kitchen table to City Hall to the state legislature. They're taking to the streets and social media and pushing for policy and system changes that will improve the world we live in. And now, more than ever, we believe that philanthropy must lift up and support grassroots and community leaders and organizations that are growing the power and voice of people of color, youth, low-income residents, and immigrants. We want to support campaigns and efforts that align with the priorities that my colleagues in our People in Place Pathways have outlined, because it is the community that is telling us that they want to have housing that is affordable, earn living wages, and send their children to schools where their children can thrive. Our plan for the open cycle is for the POWER Pathway to focus on the following three funding priorities: community organizing, civic and voter engagement, and movement building. First, we seek to support community organizing that builds a membership base, develops a pipeline of leaders of color, low-income residents, and youth, and engages communities in equity-focused activities and policy campaigns. Second, we hope to fund civic and voter engagement efforts that increase the meaningful participation of low-income people and people of color, especially youth, in nonpartisan voter registration, education, and turnout for local and state elections. And third, we want to support movement building that strengthens and expands the region's long-term organizing and advocacy infrastructure and capacity. This includes supporting equity-focused coalitions and direct service organizations with significant constituent bases that are committed to community organizing and voter engagement. Through these three strategies, we hope to build upon the Bay Area's rich legacy of social and political activism and help nurture equity movements that strengthen the community voice and power needed to advance racial and economic equity. And now I will turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Tessa. The San Francisco Foundation is currently in the process of upgrading our data and technology infrastructure. With an eye towards creating an easy-to-use and robust data system, the Foundation has begun our transition to Flux, our new grants management system. So what does this mean for you? If you have applied for a grant with us before, meaning your email address has been used within our system, you will need to reset your password and update your organization's profile by going to sff.flux.io and clicking on Forgot Password. If you are new to the Foundation and are submitting an application for the first time, you will need to create an account. It's important to note that this will take up to 48 hours within our new system, so please plan accordingly. We will be sending additional tools and resources to guide your experience with Flux following this call. If you encounter technical problems, please visit the FAQ section of our website. You can email Grants Administration, or you can review the tutorial videos we've created for you. I will now turn it back over to Kay to wrap up this portion of our webinar and begin taking your questions.
So as Jessica mentioned, we're at the end of our presentation portion of the call, so I want to remind you to submit your questions on the right side of the webinar screen. We've already started to accept some questions here, and we'll be turning over to my colleagues to respond to those. Additionally, you can submit and ask questions after the webinar by sending your queries to programs@sff.org. That's programs@sff.org. And the responses and the questions will be posted in an FAQ on our website. So let's dig in. One question is, can you expand on how and why you chose the priority neighborhoods?
I'm going to turn that over to Demetrius from our PLACE pathway to respond to that question.
Yeah, so again, just a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, is that the foundation is clear that we are not a place-based funder, meaning that our grants are not exclusive to specific neighborhoods. But for the PLACE team, we will take priority for applications that are in priority neighborhoods. And the way that we developed the notion of priority neighborhoods came from extensive data that showed several different markers for what makes up the neighborhoods where our efforts could create the greatest impact towards equity. So indications such as concentrations of people of color and families, limited economic opportunity, which has to do with education outcomes, poverty level, unemployment rates, and median income, and then risk of displacement with markers of displacement and gentrification, and all that more. Data reveal that these are the areas that the foundation, in particular through the PLACE team, should focus its efforts.
Thanks, Demetrius. We have a question from Casey Stratton. Would after-school programs serving high school students qualify under the education priority, or are you only looking to fund school-based programs? Don, I'm going to have you answer that question.
Thanks for the question. Yes, we would consider after-school programs if they were ultimately going to impact school climate on campuses.
Great. We have a question from Melissa Bennett. Can you apply for a grant during this cycle if you received funding last year? And a similar question is, will our history as a grantee have weight in your decision?
Hi, this is Jessica Minnick, the Director of Strategic Learning and Evaluation. So for the first part of the question, yes, if you received funding last year, you can apply. The caveat is if you have general operating support, which will take you through 2019, you will not be eligible for this open cycle. The thought there is that you will have funding that will take you through this next year. And then the second piece of that question was
about history as a grantee have weight in our decisions.
We look at history of the grantee, but we are also looking, especially with the open cycle, to fund new organizations. So it will be looked at, and it will be considered in the context of the fuller application.
And let me also provide some more nuance to what Jessica said. When we mean new organizations, they could be new emerging nonprofits, but they also could just mean new organizations to the foundation that they haven't received grants before. Okay, another question is, our organization and our work falls in multiple pathways. Deborah had raised the question of if we fall in both the PLACE and POWER pathways, our strategies overlap in these two categories. How do we choose which category to apply in? And a similar question is if an organization should be applying under a specific pathway or under a specific strategy. Can we expand on that? So I'm going to respond to that question. Given that our pathways are really interrelated, you do not need to apply under a specific pathway, but you'll have to choose and can choose up to 3 strategies. And just as a reminder to summarize what my colleague said, in the people pathway, 3 priority strategies are work, education, criminal justice. In the PLACE pathway, it's housing, arts and culture, community anchors. And in the POWER pathway, it's community organizing, civic and voter engagement, and lastly, movement building. So again, you'll have the opportunity in your application process to identify those strategies. They could all be within one pathway or they could be in multiple pathways, and then our internal teams will review those. Let's see, we've got a lot more questions here. Here's a question about the Flex system. Why does it take 48 hours to register an account?
So one of the things we're trying to accomplish with our new data system is having clean data. And so if you are new, if the email address you're registering is new, during that 48 hours, we are actually going to make sure that that email address doesn't already exist. So there's a manual process on the back end, and that is why we're asking for up to 48 hours. to complete that process.
Another question here is, what if you have a core operating support grant through June 2019? Will you be eligible to apply for a grant in this open cycle? What's the answer for this question here?
No. It's actually a fairly simple answer, because the grant that you have will cover roughly the same time period for the open cycle. So no, you would not be able to apply under this particular open cycle.
Thanks, Tessa. Here's a question for our People Pathway. Will you fund bridge programs from high school to college for Oakland Unified School District in particular?
This is Jadon again. If you could make a strong argument for how the bridge program impacts positive school climate in the high school, you're welcome to apply. We are in strategy development around our college and career readiness strategy. So we're contracting with Gary Yee, who has a long history of working with Oakland Unified, and we anticipate unveiling that later on this calendar year. So this open cycle was not where we're thinking about funding college and career readiness.
Jadon, I'll have you answer also this question because it relates to the People Pathway. Will you consider proposals that help formerly incarcerated people reintegrate via higher education?
That is not aligned to the strategies that are in the open cycle. We do have grantees that do this work, but those grantees we've we engage with invitational grants.
And so you can also reach out to discuss more about your program to Jadon and her team if you're interested in learning more about that.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's keep looking at all of these applications. Let's see. Demetrius, could you share a little more about supporting housing in the production category? What are some of the organizations or the types of organizations you're seeking partnership with?
Sure. So remember, when we speak about producing, one of the clearest examples of efforts to seek to produce more affordable housing is through housing bonds and affordable housing bonds. In 2016, we supported several organizations that were doing campaign work and organizing efforts and efforts around the various county housing bonds that were going on. For example, Alameda County had Measure A1, so there were organizations such as East Bay Housing Organizations that had support, or nonprofit housing organizations were some of our grantees during that time towards Measure A1. Coming in 2018, another measure that is coming up is actually a statewide bond towards affordable housing. So that those two organizations I named aren't restrictive of the types of organizations, but they are examples, and bonds are the easiest examples of what kind of work we support towards producing more housing.
Systemic change.
And systemic change.
Okay. Let's see. If an applicant works with several different priority neighborhoods, should their application focus around just one of those neighborhoods, or could they apply for focus in multiple neighborhoods?
So for priority neighborhoods, and again, to help, because I see there are several questions on it, there is more detail about what we mean and some examples of the different neighborhoods in our guidelines. So first, I'd direct you to look more closely at our guidelines, which we did send out before and included a link in the chat box. And for now, and you're welcome to follow up with us in the PLACE team to get more detail, but I would say to include the areas of your work in your application. And so if you work in several priority neighborhoods, it's not a harmful thing to include all the places that you work.
Thanks, Demetrius. We have a couple questions here about kind of the grant period. Folks want to know if our grant awards are made in October in 2018, must the grant-funded activities begin post-award? And then one example of that question here is concerning the power pathway in particular. We're conducting a movement building initiative in East Contra Costa this spring and repeating it in West Contra Costa in the fall. Would these events fit in that grant period?
Hi, this is Tessa Callejo again. The best way to answer this question, I think, is that if you look at your initiative and the work that starts in the spring, you could not ask for funding for it if we're making a grant in October, because we can only fund work that is going forward from the time that you would receive the grant award. But if you had a part of that grant that would begin in the late fall, for example, in West Contra Costa County, and then if there was additional follow-up and it was a year-long grant, then absolutely you should apply for both parts of that initiative.
I would also add that for this example in particular, we also have our ongoing Rapid Response Fund for movement building, and those are reviewed on a regular, timely basis. They're smaller grants. You can apply to them via our website, and our internal team looks at those practically monthly. So if there is a high need for your proposal and your work happening this spring, that's another avenue where you could apply for funds for the program happening in the spring, and then apply for the funds in the fall and moving forward.
And that's a great answer, Kay. I mean, that grant pool will fund up $3,000 to $15,000 is the size of the grants. They really need to be time sensitive and one-time projects, not just your general core operating. So it sounds like there might be a potential fit there, and we'd really love to talk to you more and hear more about your work. So thanks for the question.
Here's the question, I think, Tessa, also, again, for you, actually, for all of the pathways. Will you consider proposals from organizations that are not from the Bay Area, but conduct statewide work and regional Bay Area work that supports and has impact in the 5 area communities that we focus on?
Yes, absolutely. We already support quite a number of organizations that have offices or main offices that are outside the 5 counties, but it is absolutely essential that you have work, you have a footprint of work that's really substantive in the Bay Area for us to consider you in this open cycle. I hope that answers the question.
Sounds good. Keep the questions coming. Let's see. Here's a question from Karen. Will you be considering funding for programs that primarily operate within correctional facilities in this open cycle?
Hi, Karen. This is Jadon again. Generally not. I guess only if you could make a case around the impact of that program on justice reinvestment. So if it's like active advocacy to, curb jail expansion or something like that, but, generally service provision or bridge programs, we're not funding that kind of work in correctional facilities.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jadon. Another question is, some of these are very similar, so we'll be sure that in our FAQs that we'll group the questions that you have together according to topic, and we believe that a lot of them could probably be answered or stated there. Here's one for the people pathway. Can you please provide a concrete example of a systemic change that a grant recipient in the people pathway accomplished last open cycle?
Great. I'll provide 2. The first one was from the Mentoring Center. So they were able to launch a pilot program for, it was an alternative to incarceration program, but basically it was to send young women instead of incarcerating them to an educational program, which would help them finish their high school schooling, get their high school diploma, and also get them exposed to college. And it was a this pilot. The first year was accomplished last year, and we funded them multi-year. And really the ultimate goal is to prove to Alameda County that this kind of alternative to incarceration program works, and to make it like a viable alternative placement at the county level for young women. And then the second example is the Justice Reinvestment Coalition. We funded several of the partners there, and they had already won 1,400 jobs from Alameda County for formerly incarcerated folks, and we wanted to continue to support some of those anchor organizations to continue to push for implementation of that win. So again, I think we're not just looking for the win. I think we're trying to stick with organizations to carry the win out.
Thanks, Don. Some of our current grantees have some questions about the fact that their current grant might end in May, but that these new grants through the open cycle aren't going to be funded in October. They want to know what they should do about that gap. In that case, I would definitely contact your program officer or program staff that you have been working with on that particular current grant, and touch base with them about that. We've been thinking about that deeply and also recognize that there would be a gap in the timing having moved to this new open cycle timeline. And there was also a question about reposting the timeline. Again, the webinar slides will be posted online and be available within the next few days, next 24 hours, and also as well as the responses to these questions. And you'll also see the timeline within the draft guidelines. Again, there's a link to the PDF version of those draft guidelines. The reason they're in draft form is we really want to take any of these questions, and you all have been raising some really good questions, want to make sure that if there are any areas that we can continue to clarify within those guidelines, that we'll make those adjustments, again, to be more clear and transparent in the guidelines. And we'll repost the final version of those guidelines after this call. One final question that we wanted to respond to was around the metrics and what kind of metrics we would be most interested in through this open cycle. So I'm going to turn that over to Jessica.
Great. Thank you. So within our application, we're asking that people really use the SMART acronym, right? Is that when you're talking about your work, that you're specific, that it's measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. We are still really refining the measurements that we want to see, but really the big questions are, how much are you doing? How well are you doing it? Who's better off? For example, if you are working on housing, we would expect to see things like evictions prevented, or number of affordable housing units that were preserved, right? If you are in the people pathway and you're looking at positive school climate, we would expect to see, the number of students that are participating and measurements about how they are better off as a result of your program, whether it be increased graduation or measures of connection to the school. So right now, I think that those are the three big questions that you want to answer with your metrics. We are really trying to be thoughtful in not asking people to, not putting onerous demands around data, but really trying to think through what is data that people are already collecting because they need that information, and then how do we on our end do some of the work to aggregate that up. So that is all work in progress.
Great. Some clarifying questions and kind of next steps. What's the best way to follow up with a team? I suggest that if you're a current grantee, connecting with your program staff person, your program officer is the best way to connect. If you are going to be a new applicant for an open cycle grant, please submit your question or query or comment to programs@sff.org. Again, that's programs@sff.org. We'll have all of this information available on the web, and we'll also proactively be sending this out the slides as well as our FAQs. And there will also be a link to this webinar. We saw some comments in the chat box that some of the webinar was cutting in and out, so we want to make sure that we'll get that out to you in the coming days. All right. So thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, the links to the recording of the call, these additional resources and guidelines will be shared. Again, you can continue to use the programs at sff.org to ask us questions or even provide us some feedback. We'll continue to keep you updated through the website and emails and posts so that we can communicate our progress in real time and keep you informed about the ways to get engaged, apply for a grant, or participate in a program. And as closing, I just really wanted to reflect and also share that all of us here at the San Francisco Foundation are honored to be working with all of you as we all seek to advance racial and economic equity across the Bay Area. Thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on this webinar. Have a nice afternoon.